Hello again to all subscribers and listeners of this channel. Today, this is Why Evolution is Bullshit Part 2, The Multiple Reasons, 23 through 26. Again, as I've said before, and I'll keep saying this, evolution is the hypothesis posing as a theory that people believe is a fact. In this part of the series, I'm going to reiterate some points I made about the 12 clotting factors for healing wounds. I also shall bring up some new points. One talking about how plants can't be following the evolutionary process based off of their anatomy. I also will break down how flowers and honeybees relationship is far too symbiotic and far too systematic to fit into the evolutionary hypothesis. And I will also reiterate how the fruit fly experiments are flawed and how the experiments results were not anywhere near a demonstration of evolution or even adaptation. And without further ado, let us begin. Number 23. Again, I shall reiterate in some major sections of the parts there in the earlier part of the series. So, the 12 clotting factors for flesh wounds in living organisms. And I already covered this in Why Evolution is Bullshit Part 2, The Multiple Reasons, 16 through 18. And this was in, what I'm about to repeat is specifically in 16-A. Just felt like reiterating a few things. So 23A. And this is an excerpt from allocation.com. And I'm going to put the link in the description. But let me quote. And I quote, "The blood clotting process is complex and involves many reactions. However, the process can be summarized in these 3 or 4 steps. Step 1, a complex known as prothrombin activator is produced by a long sequence of chemical reactions. Step 2, the prothrombin activator converts a blood protein called prothrombin into another protein called thrombin. Step 3, the thrombin converts a soluble blood protein called fibrinogen into an insoluble protein called fibrin, or fibrin, hope I'm pronouncing it right. And step 4, fibrin exists as solid fibers which form a tight mesh over the wound. The mesh traps platelets and other blood cells and forms the blood clot. Prothrombin and fibrinogen are always present in our blood, but they aren't activated until prothrombin activator is made when we are injured." Unquote. Also on the site, allocation.com. That's OWLCATION.com. Allocation is a list of the 12 actual clotting factors of healing a wound. I'll repeat the list here, or I won't actually repeat it here, but you'll see the list when you click the link in the description. 23B. This process, as far as I can tell, has not been explained through the evolutionary theory. No one has been able to show us how the first organism evolved to create this process of healing a flesh wound, and they probably never will. Like I did early in the series, I'll repost links in the description to all the info describing the multiple stages and the factors of blood clotting, and you'll see for yourself what I'm talking about. How this complex process to keep us from bleeding to death cannot be explained by the evolutionary theory. They just don't seem to have an explanation for how we got this or where it first came from. But let's continue. 24. Now this is a big one, at least to me it is. How do plants evolve when they can't move, they can't travel, they don't have brains, they don't have a nervous system? How would they follow this mechanism of adapting and then evolving and becoming different species of plants? If it's hard for animals to do this or hard for me to conceive animals doing this, it seems like it's many multitudes harder for a plant to do this. But let's get into it. 24a. First, let us examine how plants reproduce. Plants, whether they be flowers, trees, shrubs, bushes, etc., they come usually as a male and a female, although some plants are able to produce asexually, but we won't get into that. The females produce eggs in their ovary, very much like fauna. The males produce sperm, and the sperm is inside the male plant's body, is put into a grain of pollen and is stored there. The male usually releases this pollen into his surrounding environment, where the pollen must find its way to the mouth of the female's pollen tube and eventually reach the egg of the female for fertilization, which would then eventually grow into a seed. So once the sperm enters the egg, the process of conception begins, and the egg and sperm grow into a zygote. The zygote matures into a seed, and once it reaches a certain level of maturity, the seed drops from the mother plant as a seed, a nut, or a fruit that either gets lodged into some soil, gets somehow buried, or gets eaten, but the digestive enzymes inside that animal breaks down some of the coating on most seeds, so when the animal passes the seed through its digestive tract, the seed can germinate much more easily. Because there are some seeds that can't germinate unless they actually are eaten and then pass through the digestive tract first. 24b. Next, we shall go over the many problems that plants have in terms of evolving and or adapting. Now, here's a major problem. The entire process of reproduction in plants occurs while the plants never move. Plants obviously can't walk, they can't fly, they can't swim. Plants have no way of relocating themselves from a hostile environment other than being passively relocated by water or wind, which is very mostly random and really not a viable way for an entire population of species to move from point A to point B. So if the environment becomes too inhospitable for them, they just simply die off. They don't survive because they can't transport themselves to safety. The very nature of plants being physically rooted in place makes it very difficult for one to see how they can adapt and change when they are forced to be in only one region of the planet only. Part of adaptation is being able to move around, travel, and or migrate. Exactly how did plants evolve if they can't adapt? How can plants adapt when, unlike animals, animals can move physically place to place, plants cannot? The main thing that allows animals to get used to a totally different environment is being able to move from place to place. Migration, relocation, etc. 24c. Finally, let's look at what plants need for this process. The things needed seem to exist only in animals and not plants. And even animals, I have a hard time seeing how they actually evolved according to the evolutionary process. So either the plants can't really do this, or their plants are heavily dependent on animal species in order for this process to occur, the so-called process of evolution. Plants need to spread their pollen. Wind currents only spread a portion of their pollen, and most wind-driven pollen is lighter, smaller, and spread mostly of crops that do produce large quantities of pollen. So again, plants need to spread their pollen. Wind currents can only spread some portion of pollen from certain species, and of those species of plants, those plants produce pollen that is lighter, smaller, and it tends to spread mostly from crops that produce large quantities of pollen in the first place. Plants need to spread their seed. Another thing that severely hinders their ability to adapt, because the seed nor the plant have much control over where that seed is going to land, let alone where that future plant is going to grow, or if it germinates. And if it germinates, it will germinate wherever it lands or wherever it ends up. This seriously hinders its ability to survive in certain environments and therefore adapt to its surroundings. Plants also cannot establish a territory. They can't really protect themselves from immediate harm. And as far as we know, they can't really communicate to others if there's a threat nearby, as far as we know. All these things make it hard to see how plants would have evolved to become different species of what they are. Again, these type of characteristics make it harder and harder to accept that there wasn't some type of grand design or some type of program to these organisms and how they relate to each other. Number 25. Why are honeybees so efficient at pollinating flowering plants? The evolutionary theory does not explain to us the way in which honeybees know how to pollinate flowers and make honey. It's almost as if they were created with this ability from the very beginning. And I would also say the same thing about spiders and how they weave their web. How does an animal that has such a small brain evolve the ability to do something that's relatively complex, like create a spider web or produce honey, when it's so unique to that specific species of organism? It doesn't make sense. But let's continue. As far as the honeybees, 25A. How do honeybees pollinate flowers? A honeybee colony is a type of insect that can see different frequencies. So basically, honeybees have a specific type of eye structure that allows them to see different frequencies or colors in the brightly colored flower petals. They use some sort of sophisticated magnetic mechanism to figure out which flowers have nectar. They then go to the flowers to collect the flower's nectar, and in turn they collect lots and lots of pollen that automatically gets transferred from plant to plant as the bee collects nectar to make into honey. Now, the relationship between brightly colored flowering plants and honeybees, again, seems to be very symbiotic. It's as if the two organisms were designed for each other. They didn't necessarily evolve that way, because again, the symbiosis is way too well coordinated. 25B. Interesting facts about honeybees and flowering plants. Flowering plants have larger, heavier grains of pollen that are easier for the bees to pick up and carry from place to place. Non-flowering plants, their pollen is too light and not, sticky enough or structured the right way for bees to carry it. Very interesting. Bees physically have the body size that's nearly perfect for most species of flowering plants. That's not coincidence. There's something else going on there. Bees have hairy bodies that are excellent for collecting pollen in a way that sticks to the bee's body during long distance flights. So bees have hair or fur, and no one seems to be able to explain how they evolved that, yet most insects tend to have much smoother exoskeletons. Another one. Bees produce colonies that have populations of between 20,000 to 80,000 individuals on average, and it's closer to 20,000 during the colder months and closer to about 80,000 during the warmer months. So in the summertime, you're looking at about 80,000 or close to it. In the wintertime, when they're, hibernating, you're looking at a population that's closer to 20,000. Another one. Flowering plants somehow figured out that to spread their heavier pollen, they need to be brighter, produce nectar for the bees, and also produce strong aromas that help attract the bees. Again, how did the flower know how to do that? We don't know. And evolution doesn't seem to do a good job of explaining how the flower knew to do that to the bee, and vice versa. Bees, on the other hand, somehow develop hairy bodies that move heavier grains of pollen while collecting nectar. Bees, according to some scientific studies, might even use electrostatic or electromagnetic forces to draw the pollen onto their furry bodies, which again cannot be explained through the evolutionary hypothesis or theory, whichever one you want to call it. Again, how do these two radically different organisms not only develop so many physical characteristics that favor each other, but how did they know to develop these characteristics that benefits the other organism? When one, the bee, has a nearly microscopic brain, and the other one, the flowering plant, has no brain at all. How did they both gain this knowledge to have these abilities that work so well with each other? It doesn't make sense, and no one seems to have a solid explanation as for how that came to be. 25C. The honeybee dance, also known as the waggle dance, quote unquote waggle dance. Honeybees do an elaborate dance in the hive that extraordinarily tells other bees the angle and the distance of important things like good nectar-rich flowers, water sources, or even new locations to build a new colony, a new beehive. And the other bees in the colony somehow understand this waggle dance and are able to use it to maximize their yields of honey for the colony. So the dance involves the honeybee finding a place in the hive where the bee lands. It goes around in a particular area in a semicircle, stops, turns around, vibrates his body side to side in a squiggly line pattern, then turns to the other side to complete another semicircle in the opposite direction of the original semicircle. So if you imagine it, or when you look at the picture that you're going to see in this video, the figure created looks vaguely like a figure 8 with the squiggly line or the diagonal line, whatever you want to call it, going down the middle of down the center of the figure 8. That's vaguely what it looks like. Now, along the honeybee's supposed evolution, how and when did the bee learn how to do the waggle dance? Like, how do you evolve something as complex as a dance that tells other bees direction and angle of something as important as the flowers that they need to collect nectar from? How can bees measure distance while flying? Because apparently the bee already knows the distance that the flower is away from it and is able to translate that through the waggle dance. So they somehow are able to track distance. Again, there's no explanation for that. How can the bees measure the angles of where the flowers are as well as the angle of the sun? Another one. How can the other bees understand what the dancing bee is telling them? Another one. None of this is explained by the evolutionary theory. None of it. And that's the problem. Like, there's a lot of relatively complex animal behaviors that either is somehow programmed into the animal or somehow learned it. But it couldn't have evolved when it's something that complex like a waggle dance, nectar collecting, honey creation, web weaving. These things are a little bit too complex for such small, simple-minded creatures to be able to just evolve that way. Again, it doesn't make sense. 25D. Where did the bees first learn these efficient ways of pollinating plants? Many of which we humans need for agriculture. Also, how did bees know to grow their hair fur on their bodies that's nearly perfect for the pollen collection? How did the flowers evolve the flower petal in the different colorations that apparently are very bright both in visible light and apparently in UV light? How did they get the different colorations on the petals when the plants can't see what they look like? They don't have eyes. They don't have any of that. But they somehow evolved these brightly colored flower petals. How did the flowers evolve the aromas, the smells that they produce that seem to aid in drawing the bees in towards them so that way the bees can get nectar and the flowers can get their pollination going? Another one. Oh no, again, this comes across, the way I look at it, more and more as some type of pre-programmed system in the DNA of the honeybee and the flower that has always been there. The symbiosis seems far too perfected to have gradually become this way or to have developed over a long period of time by chance. Doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense at all. But I've yet to hear a good evolutionary explanation as to where these symbiotic characteristics of the bee and the flower come from. Number 26. Going back to the fruit fly experiment. The fruit flies simply changed their diet and their mating behavior. That is not evolution. That's not even adaptation. That's just a simple change in behavior based off environment. That's it. You all are reaching way too much. You're pushing your ideas into what you get in your experiments. You're pushing your ideas into your results instead of letting your results tell you what's going on. But as stated in Why Evolution is Bullshit Part 2, the multiple reasons, 7-11. And what I'm about to repeat comes directly from number 11-A. Evolution nor adaptation have been observed in real time. Adaptation has been assumed. Evolution has been assumed. And these assumptions have been passed off as fact. To reiterate, A. The experiment with fruit flies was performed by Dr. Diane M. Dodd a couple decades ago. B. She brought two groups of fruit flies into two separate microenvironments. C. In these two environments, the fruit flies were fed different diets. One group was fed sugary diets or a sugary diet, while the other one was given a starchy diet. D. The two groups were brought together where their respective diets changed, and so did their particular mating partners. Sugar-eating flies mated with sugar-eating flies. Starch-eating flies did the same with starch-eating flies. E. This was somehow proof of adaptation, when in reality, it proved nothing of the sort. It only proved that organisms have a preference for food and mating partners after being in a particular environment for a particular period of time. That's it. F. This does not show any physical change in their body structure. It does not show any change in their DNA or major change in the fruit fly's very nature at all. It's simply people trying their hardest to pack evolutionary theory into every observation that they make and every experiment that they conduct. AKA, this is not really sound science. This is a lot of biases and ideology seeping into science and still calling itself science. It's more and more of the same. Reiterated. In conclusion, many organisms display complex processes that have not been proven to have gone through any evolutionary process, nor can scientists explain how the organism survived before that complex process came to fruition. So they can't tell you where it came from, they can't tell you how the organism got that way, and they can't tell you how the organism survived before it gained that particular characteristic or ability. An example of this is the 12 clotting factors of healing flesh wounds. Then there's organisms that have complex characteristics, but not only is there no evolutionary explanation for how they obtained those characteristics, but those organisms lack many physical features that that the organism would have to have in order to evolve those characteristics in the first place. Plants are a perfect example of this. They have bright petals, sperm, eggs, seeds, leaves, aromas, stems, etc. Yet they have no brain, no locomotion, no spinal column, no nervous system, nothing like that. The very existence of plants, far as I can see, contradicts the idea that organisms can adapt and then evolve into different species based off of environmental stressors. Finally, what are supposed to be two simple or two much simpler organisms, the flowering plant and the honeybee. As far as I can see, they're not that simple. Instead, they are well-designed organisms with complex systems of symbiotic survival traits such as pollen hairs, waggle dances, and electrostatic cling of bees, as well as the bright colors, nectar generation, and aroma creation of flowers. This is very complex, well-designed, well-put-together stuff that cannot be explained with evolution. All of these systems are so well-coordinated, yet neither flower nor bee possesses the faculties needed to generate such complex traits. They don't have the brain or the brain capacity. They don't have the nervous system. They don't have the complex organ systems that should develop these characteristics that they have, but they have these characteristics anyway. Yet, we're led to believe that these two organisms, flowering plants and honeybees, these organisms that can't think, they can't speak, they can't communicate on a high level, they're somehow able to have these complex relationships with each other and have done so for eons only because of evolution. Evolution is the main thing that caused this to happen to these two organisms, according to the scientists. Sorry, but I'm not buying it. And then there's the blatant fallacy of the fruit fly experiment that was conducted a couple decades ago. Again, if you really try to look at this objectively and try to be open-minded and just really be critical about this, you're going to see that evolution is flawed. This is not a good enough explanation as to where organisms came from or how they came to have the characteristics that they have on planet Earth. But that's it for now. I'm going to stop right here. Until the next part in the series, please like, subscribe, share, and donate to support this channel. You have a nice day. I'm out. Peace.